weirdness. Live. Start. Hi, media platforms. Why are you so annoying? Why? Okay, well, after that super auspicious start, let's get going, shall we? Okay, let's do it. I even set up my camera in a different way. Oh, okay, it's fine. I'm fine. We're fine. Hey, my name is Dr. Shannon Coates. My pronouns are she, they. Welcome to this live office hours on Friday, December the 2nd. Yes, I am coming to you live from a little town that's north of Toronto in Canada, and the land that I am privileged and grateful to live and work on are the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Wendake-Neowensio peoples. Just so you know. Okay. So on Monday, I am doing a class and a panel. The class is just me blathering on for a couple of hours. I'm talking about how we learn. But really we're talking about, it's not like we are talking about how we learn. We're going to do just a brief outline of how we learn. And then we're going to look at a bunch of the pedagogic principles or the things that I have, been talking about for quite a while, and that I've been working with voice teachers to bring into their teaching. And those principles, we're going to talk about those. And we're going to talk about how and where those principles kind of fit into the learning process, and then why they work. Like where in the learning process they kind of snoop in. And we're going to talk a little bit about, the application. And then in the panel with Cindy Dewey, then we're going to really get down to the application and really how to put this into practice in our teaching. So if you are interested in that, I hope you'll join us. If you can't make it live, the replay is available for until the end of January. So, get on out there if you can. Okay, today, I put up a couple of semi-controversial posts this week. Of course I did. A little bit controversial. I don't think I'm that being that controversial, but anyway, it's fine. So the post I did on Tuesday talked about things that we teach in voice ped classes that are not, and courses that are not necessarily directly related to voice pedagogy. They aren't actually pedagogy, right? They can kind of fall under the category. And so some of the things that I talked about, I said, some of the things that I listed, sort of like anatomy and physiology of the vocal instrument. It's not actually pedagogy. The, understanding acoustics, understanding vocal tract shaping, understanding styles, understanding mix, knowing what happens with being able to diagnose. Excuse me. All of those things are terrific. And I teach them. And I have had, a whole course on it. On basically the anatomy and physiology of the voice, right? How do these things work together to help us create the sounds that we want to create, right? So all of those things, yes, those things are all great. And they're not technically pedagogy. Why aren't they pedagogy? Well, let's talk about what pedagogy is. And I talked a little bit about that yesterday. So let's talk a little bit about what pedagogy is. Let's kind of get into it a little bit today. So the definition of pedagogy, I went and, I got all fancy and looked up the etymology, where this word came from. And so pedagogy actually started, it has Greek, Latin roots, blah, blah, blah. And so it's been used for a long time in our educational circles, for a long time, and came out of the methods we use to teach to work with boys, actually, which I did not know, and then kind of morphed into the methodology of teaching young learners or children. So how we work with young children. And a pedagogue, for a very long time, was considered a teacher of children. So folks who work with children, a teacher of children is a pedagogue, right? So in our more sort of contemporary understanding, if you take a look, if you take a look at sort of educational circles, if you just like Google it, look on Wikipedia, whatever, our more contemporary understanding of that word is the methodology, the art, the science of teaching. In other words, how we teach. What are the ways that we teach? What do we do when we teach? Currently, if you look this up, it'll be the art and science of teaching or of education, right? So that's part of the reason why, all my stuff is like, the art and science. I don't even remember what my tagline. What's my tagline? The art and science of teaching voice. I don't even remember what my tagline is. I don't know. Whatever my tagline is, it talks about the art and science of teaching, right? That's good, Shannon. You can remember that. It'll come to me halfway through. So then I was like, okay, so where do we get this, the notion of pedagogy? Because all of our courses now, like all of our voice pedagogy courses, they're all called voice pedagogy or vocal pedagogy, right? Like they're all called like pedagogy courses. And so we take these courses in these science courses, we take these courses in schools or, in our degree, or we take them from, independent providers such as myself. We take these courses and they're called voice pedagogy courses or vocal pedagogy courses. And so then I was curious, where did that first come from? And so I pulled out my singing, the mechanism and the technique. I pulled out my Vernard from the 1940s. And this one is, I think, the 1967 edition. Is that correct? Or 1976? I think it's 67. The greatly enlarged, what's it called? Revised edition, greatly enlarged, 1967. And in no place in this book, it's a seminal text, and it's a seminal voice ped text, and lots of courses still refer to it, and it holds up relatively well in terms of the science. I mean, there was a lot we didn't know in the 40s, 50s, and 60s when that text was being written and revised. At no place in the text does Vernard refer to pedagogy. So in no place, the actual word, in no place in the text is the actual word used. Although I just did a very preliminary search, so it's possible that it is in there. But if it is in there, it is not front and center. And there also is nothing in the text that talks about how to teach, right? It is about the technique, the science and the technique. So it is vocal technique. It is what's happening in the voice, how we make these sounds, what the muscles are doing, blah, blah, blah. It's all that stuff. So, there is stuff about how to teach, but it is, it's a little bit old school, it's a little bit prescriptive, right? But there isn't a deep kind of dive into methodology or how we should impart this information. There's no dive into how we should impart this information. So when we get up to again, I pulled a bunch of books off my shelf here. Now my office is a mess and I'm gonna have to clean it up afterwards or else my brain will go crazy. I can't handle a messy office. Anyway, here we go. Basics of vocal pedagogy. So we get up to where in the 1970s, right? Mid 70s. Basics of vocal pedagogy. So this guy, or this text, says right out front, basics of vocal pedagogy. So this text actually, interestingly enough, and I want to just make sure I've got all this stuff here that I want to say. Yes, interestingly enough, it is about a 275-page book, and there is the final chapter in the book, or 15 pages of the book out of 275, is actually dedicated to pedagogy, to how we teach, to understanding methods of teaching. So the final chapter is literally called Teaching Singing, History of Vocal Pedagogy, Comparative Pedagogy, Foundations of Effective Teaching, Instructional Strategies, Techniques, and Tools, Lifespan Voice Teaching, and Modes of Instruction. So there actually is pedagogy in this book, meaning he actually talks about He talks about teaching adolescent males, remember in the 1970s, talks about teaching children, vocal development, lifespan of it, talks about instructional models, which is very interesting. Where does he, so he actually talks about didactic teaching model versus the critical thinking model. So this is actually quite, and instructional strategies, techniques, and tools. So these are actually quite, this is pedagogy related, right? Like this is actual pedagogy. So there is some in this text. And this is a text that has been used quite a bit in voice ped classes and courses, of course. And then I took a little look at I looked at the Matthew Huck's, the Dictionary of the Modern Singer. So I just did a little bit of research in there. There is a section on vocal pedagogy and vocal pedagogue. And I think this is from the maybe 2014, 2015, give or take. So I would imagine that there are some, I don't know. I haven't asked Matthew about this, but I would imagine that there are some definitions in here that, given the chance, he would update. I would imagine. However, maybe not. I don't know. But here we go. So there's a whole 4 paragraphs on vocal pedagogy and explaining vocal pedagogy, except that so the first sentence is the study and practice of voice teaching. Okay, so studying voice teaching, studying how to teach, one thinks, and practicing teaching, right? So the actual how of teaching. Good. Okay. And then there's a whole thing of science and technology and vocology and how vocal pedagogy has historically been associated with classical vocal styles. I mean, there's an understanding of all that. And then we see at the very end, many additional terms in this book also relate to vocal pedagogy. See also appoggio, balanced breathing, chest, coup de glace, CT dominant, false, vocal full contraction, head, historical pedagogy, hyperfunction, hypofunction, methodologist, mode 1, mode 2, psyche, soma, systematic pedagogy, TA dominant. So there are 17 or 18 terms there. And 3 of them are actually pedagogy related. In other words, how we teach. They're actually related to the study and practice of voice teaching, right? The rest of those terms are related to vocal technique, anatomy and physiology, technique, what's happening in the voice. That's all good. It's not bad. It's just that this isn't really pedagogy. And so when we get over to systematic pedagogy, which let me just look it up, it's all alphabetical, so it's pretty easy to go through here. We talk about he talks about the definition. Systematic pedagogy, where is it? Y comes after T, so I will go a little farther. I'm going to be Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Sutherland, syllabification, symbolism, sympathetic resonance. Systematic pedagogy is the last one in here. You're welcome for that, too. So a term associated with American vocal pedagogue Richard Miller, who introduced a logical, systematic way to train singers technically. So Miller advocated that all voice teachers should systematically address specific technical topics in every voice lesson, particularly with young singers, or I would say untrained singers, not as well-trained singers perhaps, or singers at the beginning of their learning journey perhaps. And those topics include onset, release, breath management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a description of a way, of a syllabus, right? This is a syllabus, basically, of the topics that you're going to teach. But it doesn't tell you how to teach them, right? It doesn't address any of the, how do I deliver this information? What do I do with this information? Here's all the information that needs to be addressed, or here are all of the modes, here are all the, what does he say again? All of the topics. Here are all of the topics that need to be addressed. So it's systematic in that sense. It's fantastic. But it's a, outline, right? It's not actually, pedagogy in the sense of, how do I teach it? What do I actually do? What do I say? How do I communicate? what is the best way to provide feedback, for example? What kinds of feedback are there? Maybe some questions like that. What are some methodologies around teaching? How do we understand how to teach? How do we understand how to deliver this information? So we kind of come through that kind of idea of systematic training is, it's quite, it's quite at the fore of our, of our pedagogy right now, the idea of the systematic training. Dr. Ragan's book is a terrific example of that, where there's a whole system of the things to address and exercises to address and what's happening. It's vocal technique, right? So it's how to, it's what to address. It's not how, though. It's not how. So we come in then into, folks like Lynn Helding with The Musician's Mind, and of course her column throughout her column in Journal of Voice. And we start to then see some of the application, or we start to see some of the way we learn and understand the way we learn, and start to apply that a little bit more to teaching and to how to deliver the information that we have, right? Because we're like, okay, people learn in this way. There's this like process that has to happen. And so because this process happens, then we need to, these things need to happen as we deliver the information, or while we're in the studio, and while we're following this system and addressing these specific topics. How we're addressing these specific topics can reliably be related back to how we learn. And when we as I read through Lynn's book, and and some other, and also I've done a lot of I follow Heidi Moss very, very closely. I love her work because Heidi also talks about, not necessarily from the the more philosophical how we learn, if that makes sense, but really talks about okay, and then the hippocampus does blah, 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 and the neurons do blah, blah, blah. I talk to Heidi because she actually has all the research, and she'll be and this is why this works. So we start to see that. But as I get all of this information around how we learn and what the brain is doing and all that, we start to get all of that information. All of this information explains why the pedagogy works. So why the pedagogy why the pedagogic principles that I have either, not just myself, lots of people have either stolen from other fields, or, so I'm taking a lot of these pedagogic principles from yoga, or from coaching, or from therapy, or from our educational colleagues who are actually learning they're actually learning pedagogy, right? They're learning methodologies of teaching. They're learning about forms of feedback, how and when to give it. They're learning about student-directed learning. They're learning about how do we support student-led learning. They're learning about actual methodologies to how to deliver information in the most effective way possible for the deepest kind of learning possible. They're learning about formulative assessments. They're learning about how do we encourage self-assessment? How do we support self-assessment, assessment? So they're learning about all of these things in the educational field. And they're applying it in classrooms, of course, so it's a little bit of a different application in the one-on-one voice studio. And also then from, I'm observing 15 to 20 brand new teachers every single year for a decade now, observing and trying to assess, but not only trying to assess those teachers in an undergrad voice ped class, but not only trying to assess those teachers, but trying to come up with a rubric to assess those teachers, trying to come up with a fair way and a clarity around here are the principles, here are the things to do so that your teaching is more effective. And so me combining all of those things together means that I've had a 5-second rule for quite a long time. where, you're not allowed to give feedback until at least 5 seconds after the singer has completed the thing that you asked them to do. I also have a 3 times rule, minimum 3 times rule. In other words, the singer has to do the thing at least 3 times before you give a new directive or any feedback, right? So I've got a couple of rules. They're not really rules. They're like guidelines, right? That have come out of observing teachers teaching for the first time and observing what is useful, and also, of course, my own teaching. And then talking to people in other fields and talking to education folks and being like, okay, so this is actually a thing. And then when I read Lynn Helding's book and I'm like, oh, there's a reason that we wait 5 seconds, that this 5-second rule is useful. And then I go, Heidi Moss calls this the space between, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Heidi. I think you call it the space between, right? And actually she has a YouTube video up right now that is fantastic, talking about the space between and why we need this space in order to consolidate the learning. And okay. So these pedagogic principles tell us how to deliver the information the most effective way possible. For the most part, unless you are like Amelia Rollings, Amelia, what's your third name? It's left me now. For the most part, unless your voice ped class has been taught by education majors, like the folks who actually do teach this stuff and who are thinking through these things and who are, working with educational and learning models, we're not learning this in our voice ped classes, especially not in our undergrad voice ped classes. When I'm teaching undergrad voice ped classes, I am teaching these things implicitly, certainly, very rarely teaching them explicitly, but I am absolutely teaching them implicitly by saying, hey, it's going to be deeper learning if you observe the 5-second rule. I don't have time in my undergrad voice ped class. Unfortunately, I don't have time to do a whole semester on learning and how we learn and then pedagogy, right? I don't have a whole semester, but I am teaching it implicitly, and I'm intentionally making sure that these principles, if you will, are included in the pedagogy and in their teaching. But for the most part, we're not necessarily, we're very rarely, especially in an undergrad voice ped class, and especially in a voice ped class or course. Oh, I'm so glad it's helpful. Yeah, so especially in a voice ped class or course, we're very rarely getting explicit information on pedagogy, how to teach. Very rarely, if ever, explicitly. Possibly in graduate courses, and possibly in, the folks who are doing the voice ped degree are getting this whole second semester. That's what we're doing. We're doing pedagogy the second semester where we're talking about it. But the other thing is, the other reason that I think this is so important is because we independent voice teachers especially, we get this trickle down expectation that the thing that is hard about our teaching, or the thing that isn't working as well in our teaching, or the thing that isn't as good in our teaching, is that we don't know enough. We don't know enough information, right? We maybe don't have enough science. We maybe don't know enough about how a belt works, or maybe we don't know enough about transitioning registers, or maybe we don't know enough about repertoire. Maybe we can't diagnose well enough. All of those things, we kind of absorb these. We absorb this message that our teaching isn't great because XYZ, right? They're not doing XYZ. And that can get us a little bit turned around, where when we're teaching, rather than focusing on the dissemination of or how we're disseminating the information, we're focusing on whether we have the right information or enough information. And so that focus can be very detrimental to our teaching, right? And the more I work with voice teachers, so I'll tell you what, one voice teacher I worked with this week through the voice ped degree, I drop into voice lessons as we're teaching, and we sort of do a little bit of co-teaching. And they were teaching and they were doing everything right, like good information, great exercises. Student was completely compliant and just like trying their best, and really like great atmosphere, supportive atmosphere, everything right. And then about 15 minutes in, or maybe a little less, I said, okay, let me model, because we've been talking about this way of teaching. We've been talking about these pedagogical principles throughout the classes we've been going. So I'm like, okay, let me model what it looks like to teach with less input. Let me model it. So I did a little bit of teaching with the same student, and I was doing some asides to the teacher. So I'm doing this because blah, blah, blah. I would never say this to the student, but this is what's happening in the back of my head, right? And we're going back and forth. And so then the teacher saw some of that, and then also did some of that same teaching. And then at the end of the session, the teacher said to me, they basically taught themselves. I didn't have to, they basically just learned it themselves, learned how to do the thing themselves. Your teaching, often the teaching is difficult, not because you don't have the right information or enough knowledge, or et cetera, et cetera. Often the teaching is difficult because of the way you're teaching. Because you're trying to solve all of the problems, you're giving all of the input, you're doing all of the feedback, which is very supportive, can feel very supportive, and feels like the right thing to do, right? I've got this information, I'm going to give you the information. You're doing all of the diagnosing yourself. All of those things are happening in your brain, and the singer isn't doing any of it for themselves. And so the actual teaching part and you're doing all of the assessment yourself, right? You're doing all of the assessment. So all of that responsibility for the learning journey is happening in you. When we hand over the responsibility, I am convinced that the farther along the trust the student, trust the singer path we get, the better our pedagogy gets, because we start to do the things that we start to teach in a different way, right? Our how is different. And then that lines up with all the information we know about how we learn. It all becomes like, oh, this is your lane. I love it. Yeah, right? So the more we say, I trust the singer, I trust the singer, I trust the singer, I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to have all the information. I don't have to have all the I don't have to do all the diagnosing, and I don't have to do all the assessing. I trust the singer, I trust the singer. The more we go toward that path, the more our pedagogy changes, right? It influences the way we teach or how we teach. It influences that. And then what happens? We're actually teaching in a way, we're delivering the information, we're leading them on a self-discovery journey or a learning journey that actually aligns with all of the things that we know about how we learn. What? It's true. It's true. The other thing that happened this week, a voice teacher sort of slid into my DMs and was like, oh, hey, when I was teaching a university student this week, there was some things going on, and I decided, based on the stuff that you've been talking about, meaning me, the things that I've been talking about around trusting your student, I decided not to nitpick. So rather than nitpicking on how they should change the breathing or how they should change the shape or the pharyngeal constriction or whatever, right? Not to nitpick about that. I decided to just sit back and let them kind of work it through. And then at the end of that lesson, this voice teacher said, I cried because by me taking a step back, trusting the singer, I stopped giving feedback in the way that I've been giving it, which, if we understand pedagogy and pedagogical methodology, it changes how we give feedback, when and how and what kind of feedback we give. Changes. But also, if we trust the student, it changes when we give the feedback, how much we give, what kind of feedback we give. If we trust the student, they go together. And also when we understand learning like the way that Heidi understands learning, we also then stop giving feedback in a specific way too, right? It changes our pedagogy. And this teacher said, because I let them just figure it out, and I let them go through their emotion, they figured it out. Mm-hmm. I know, right? So this is what I hear quite consistently from teachers, actually, is, oh wait, it can be this easy? Teaching can actually be this easy? And I can be more, oh, this is so interesting. Yeah, so your degrees are education-based. Never understood why I taught so differently than everyone else I observed or met in many organizations I'm part of. This is why. Absolutely. I am sure that's why. In general, in our pedagogy classes and courses, and also just keep in mind, right? So university teachers in voice faculties, academic teachers and voice faculties, don't have teaching degrees, generally, right? They haven't studied how to teach themselves. So, and I know this because I teach at a university, right? I know. And especially in our music faculties, right? In our music faculties, if you've had a significant career and your name can pull in students, you have a better chance of getting a job there than if you have an education degree and you can actually teach and you actually understand pedagogy. You have a way better chance of getting a job on a faculty if you've had a career versus if you have if you actually, understand teaching, understand pedagogy. So we have folks teaching pedagogy courses who, I'm sure there are folks out there who are teaching, and like I said, Amelia said that she had some grounding in teaching methodology and understanding teaching methodology and actual pedagogy, because her graduate voice pedagogy courses were taught by education people from the education faculty. So yes, of course you're going to get that information. But in general, we don't get that information. In general, what we get is voice technique, right? In general, what we get is anatomy and physiology and how the voice works. We get the science of the voice. That's in general what we get in our voice ped classes. Now, graduate classes may be different and you may get more. Undergrad voice ped classes, in general, not so much. And if you have never done a pedagogy class, then in general, the way that you're going to teach is likely going to be based on how you were taught, which is fair. That's fair. And so if you've had some terrific teachers who are, who came from this sort of philosophy of singer first and student-led learning and understanding this student-led learning, whether they had that understanding explicitly or whether it was sort of an implicit, I came across this and, oh, this seems to work, so I'm going to keep doing it kind of thing, or not, however they got that, you may be teaching in that way as well, or you may not be, right? I'm just saying the teaching may actually be harder than it needs to be. That's all I'm saying. Maybe just a little harder than it needs to be. So we get the focus on vocal technique and the fact that I should be teaching technique and the fact that I need to understand X, Y, Z and I need to have more information. And that focus can interfere with how we teach. It's not that we don't. This information is terrific. I'm not saying that the information isn't terrific. Of course I'm not saying that. Anatomy and physiology is terrific. It's great to know. I'm just starting to read this book by Christopher Goldsack called The Not So Simple Science of Singing, which is, it's interesting. So far so good. And I'm only chapter and a half in, so don't take my word for it yet. But something he says on page 3, which I thought, the truth is that I would rather be taught by someone who only knew what really good singing feels like than someone who only knows the science. But I found the process of learning about all aspects of the voice fascinating and helpful. And I would say yes, and someone who knew what it feels like to sing effortlessly, to be able to coordinate in the way that they want to coordinate in order to communicate in the way they want to communicate. So you know that I'm not like super a fan of like what really good singing feels like. You know, I'm not a super fan of that. But if we define really good singing as singing with ease and being able to communicate in the way that I want to communicate, ease and coordination, let's define it that way. Yes. And someone who knows how to teach. In other words, someone who understands some of these pedagogic principles is what I call them. I make up stuff all the time. And actually, I make up stuff all the time, like hands off, like teach with, so one of the things that I've talked about for a very long time is the speech to song ratio in the lesson. And if your speech to song ratio is off, you're giving a voice ped lesson, not a voice lesson, right? So if you're talking more, if you've got a like 80 to 20 speech to singing ratio in the voice lesson, you're doing a voice ped lesson. You're not doing a voice lesson, right? They're not learning how to sing. They're not learning to sing. They're learning how to sing. They're learning about singing. They're learning about vocal technique. They're not actually learning how to sing. So we want that. I've talked about that ratio quite a long time. I started to implement it very early when I was working with new voice teachers, where I was like, okay, let's think about how ways we can get your speech to singing ratio so that you've got a 20% speech and 80% singing ratio, right? Like, let's get that ratio from 80 to 20 to 20 to 80. Let's reverse it, right? So we're going to talk about that for a long time, and I call that like a pedagogic principle. But then, of course, like I read and like, there's actual like educational, there's actual educational words for these things. I'm not that smart. I'm not like discovering a thing that no one else has discovered. I'm just naming it weird stuff. Like the 5-second rule, which is really just about rest so that the brain can consolidate the learning. All right. All of that to say, hey, we're all doing our best here in voice ped land, and we are all trying to impart the information that we think is going to be most useful for the voice teachers who want to learn how to be more effective teachers. And in many cases, the information that we think, especially those of us who are in academia or have come through academia, in many cases, the information that we think is going to be most beneficial is not actually the information that is most beneficial for folks to be effective voice teachers. In many cases, the information that is going to be most beneficial is the pedagogy information. In other words, how we teach versus the vocal technique. Vocal technique can support pedagogic information. But if you've got all the information and you cannot get it out, or you are distributing it in an ineffective way, or you are going against a learner's learning, you're distributing the information in a way that is challenging for learners to actually learn, it's going to be hard. It's going to be way harder than it needs to be. All right. If you're interested in a much less squirrely, like off the books, actual presentation, lecture style about these things, I hope you'll consider joining me on Monday for How We Learn 101. And that's the class portion. And then for the panel with Cindy Dewey on How We Teach 101. So Cindy is someone who I heard talking about these principles of motor learning and understanding well, the principle that I say, which is you can't tell muscles what to do. Again, I made up a thing. I'm like, you can't tell muscles what to do. I made up a thing, and turns out it's a real thing that has like a way fancier like thing. But yes, so she's one of the first people that I remember hearing these principles made explicit. Okay, so that's on Monday. Feel free to join me. Love to see you in the room. Have a great weekend. Thinking maybe if you're teaching over this, think about some of the things. Oh, Helen says, it's Saturday morning here in New Zealand. Hey, New Zealand. And I am loving the focus in the session. Having an undergrad vocal performance degree and then a postgrad teaching diploma has been crucial to having a growth mindset and how to teach. Yes, love the 80-20 reminder on lesson focus. Yes, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, the teaching diploma is the information we learn in educational, and I don't have you know, formal education training. I do have a lot of friends who do, though, and I, you know, I talk to them a lot. Oh. But that is, yes, that training can be so useful because we can take those principles and put them into one-on-one voice lessons. Yeah, I'm glad that's useful, Helen. Terrific. Consider joining me, and over the weekend, if you're teaching over the weekend or the next, you know, between now and next time we talk, consider one thing. Maybe consider that 80-20 / 20-80. Oh, I'm so glad it was helpful and eye-opening. You are so welcome. Consider that 80-20 or / 20-80 sing-to-speech ratio, and maybe consider the 5-second rule. You know, maybe consider those two things in the next little while and just see what happens. Have fun. Happy voice petting. Oh, let's do that. And take care, friends.